When Walter died at 84, the small Vermont town where he'd lived his entire life assumed there had been some kind of clerical error. Walter had worked as a janitor at the local high school for over 40 years, earning a wage that never exceeded $34,000 a year at its peak. He drove a 15-year-old truck. He lived alone in a small house he'd paid off decades earlier. He clipped coupons. He wore the same handful of flannel shirts for years at a time. Nobody in town would have guessed his net worth if you'd asked them to. When his estate was finalized, Walter's investment accounts totaled just over $6 million. He left most of it to the town library and the local hospital. The gifts made regional news, not because Walter had done anything dramatic with his money, but because almost nobody could explain how a janitor earning $34,000 a year had quietly become a multimillionaire, while accountants, doctors, and business owners in the same town, earning 5 and 6 times his salary, often retired with a small fraction of what he'd accumulated. The explanation, once people actually looked into it, turned out to be almost insultingly simple. Walter had bought shares in a handful of large, stable companies starting in his 30s, reinvested every dividend automatically without exception, and never sold a single share for the rest of his life, through recessions, market crashes, interest rate spikes, and 40 years of relentless news telling him the sky was falling. He didn't pick winners through any special insight. He simply never interfered with the process once it started. This story, in one form or another, repeats far more often than most people realize, and it points to something uncomfortable about how we've been taught to think about building wealth through investing. We assume the people who end up with the most money must have started with the most money or possessed some specialized knowledge the rest of us lack. The actual evidence tells a very different story, and it explains why so many high earners retire with less than a janitor who never made more than $34,000 in a single year of his life. Let's start with what research on actual millionaires consistently reveals, because it directly contradicts the assumption most people carry about where wealth comes from. Multiple studies on self-made millionaires have found that the large majority never earned an especially high income at any point in their working lives. Most crossed into millionaire status gradually, in their late 40s or 50s, not through a single dramatic event, but through decades of unremarkable, repeated behavior. High income, it turns out, is a relatively weak predictor of ending up wealthy. Behavior over long periods of time is a dramatically stronger one. This matters because it reframes the entire question people ask about investing. The question isn't usually, how do I earn enough to invest seriously? Most people, even on modest incomes, already earn enough to build meaningful wealth over 30 or 40 years. The real question is why so many people who do have investable income still end up with so little to show for it decades later. And the answer almost always traces back to a small number of behavioral patterns that quietly work against the investor, regardless of how much money passes through their hands. The first pattern is what researchers call the complexity trap. There is an enormous industry built around convincing investors that building wealth requires sophisticated strategies, actively managed funds, alternative investments, options strategies, timing systems, and constant attention. Walter never touched any of it. He owned a small number of simple, understandable businesses and let time do the rest. Meanwhile, investors who chase complexity often end up paying substantially higher fees for underperformance because complexity is far more profitable to sell than it is to actually deliver. The evidence on this is remarkably consistent. Over long time horizons, the overwhelming majority of actively managed funds fail to outperform simple, low-cost index funds after fees are accounted for. The complexity isn't buying better returns, it's buying a story that feels more sophisticated than doing nothing. The second pattern is the trading impulse, and this might be the single most expensive habit an otherwise reasonable investor can develop. It feels productive to check your portfolio daily, to react to headlines, to make adjustments when something in the news feels alarming. It feels like diligence. Decades of research on investor behavior consistently shows the opposite. Investors who trade more frequently earn measurably lower returns than investors who trade rarely, and the gap grows wider the more frequently someone trades. This isn't because active traders are less intelligent, it's because every trade introduces an opportunity to sell during fear and buy during euphoria, which is, mechanically, the exact opposite of what builds wealth. Walter's advantage wasn't insight, it was inactivity. He simply never gave himself the opportunity to make an emotional mistake because he never looked closely enough to feel the emotion in the first place. The third pattern involves lifestyle absorption of investment gains, and it explains why higher earners so often lag behind quiet, consistent savers despite having vastly more capital passing through their hands. As a portfolio grows and generates dividends or gains, there's a strong temptation to treat that growth as spendable income, funding a better car, a larger home, or a more comfortable lifestyle. Walter reinvested every dividend, automatically, for over 40 years, without exception. That single decision, doing nothing with the cash his investments generated except letting it buy more shares, is responsible for a significant share of his eventual $6 million outcome. An investor generating the same returns but spending the dividends along the way, rather than reinvesting them, would have ended their life with a fraction of that total, despite an identical portfolio and identical performance. The fourth pattern is the comparison trap, and it's almost entirely psychological rather than mathematical. Investors surrounded by colleagues or neighbors discussing hot stocks, cryptocurrency gains, or the latest investment trend often feel pressure to abandon a boring, steady approach in favor of something that promises faster results. The evidence on chasing performance is consistent and unflattering. Money tends to flow into investments after they've already had their best run, and out of investments right before they recover, because investors are reacting to recent performance rather than fundamentals. Walter, by all accounts, was never part of any conversation about hot stocks. He wasn't chasing anything. He'd made his decision decades earlier and simply never revisited it based on what anyone else was doing. The fifth pattern is patience measured in decades rather than years. And this is where the real mathematics of Walter's outcome becomes visible. A modest portfolio earning consistent market average returns of roughly 9 to 10% annually, with dividends reinvested and left completely untouched, doesn't just grow steadily. It grows in a way that looks almost flat for the first 15 or 20 years, and then accelerates dramatically in the final decade, simply because the base amount compounding has become so large. Someone who invests consistently for 20 years and then gives up, frustrated that the numbers still look modest, misses almost the entire payoff. The majority of Walter's $6 million wasn't built in his 30s or 40s. It was built in his final 15 years, when decades of quiet compounding on a growing base finally produced numbers large enough to notice. Investors who abandon the approach after 15 or 20 years, right before the curve bends upward, are giving up during the least rewarding stretch and missing the most rewarding one entirely. None of what Walter did required identifying the next great company before anyone else noticed it. It required almost the opposite, choosing a small number of understandable, stable businesses, refusing to sell during the inevitable crashes, refusing to spend the dividends along the way, and refusing to complicate a simple process with strategies designed more to be sold than to actually work. Every one of those decisions is available to literally anyone with access to a basic brokerage account, regardless of income. This is genuinely uncomfortable for a lot of people to accept, because it removes the excuse that wealth requires a high income, insider access, or specialized financial intelligence. It also removes something people quietly enjoy, the idea that building wealth is supposed to be exciting, that it requires clever moves and sophisticated strategy. Walter's story, and the broader research it reflects, suggests almost the opposite. The investors who end up with the most money are frequently the ones for whom investing was the most boring, uneventful part of their entire life. Nothing to talk about at dinner parties, nothing to brag about, just decades of automatic, unremarkable repetition that nobody, including Walter himself, thought was particularly noteworthy until the final number appeared. If you're currently investing and feel like nothing seems to be happening, like your account balance looks roughly the same as it did 2 years ago, despite consistent contributions, that feeling is not a sign that the approach is failing. For almost every long-term investor, the first 15 years look unremarkable by design. That's not the absence of progress. That's the quiet, invisible part of the process where the foundation gets built before anyone, including you, can see it working. Walter never explained his strategy to anyone in town, mostly because nobody ever asked, and partly because he probably wouldn't have described it as a strategy at all. He bought shares in businesses he understood. He let the dividends buy more shares automatically, and he didn't look closely enough, or often enough, to talk himself out of it. 4 decades later, that was worth $6 million, quietly, to a town that had no idea it was happening the entire time. This story reveals a truth most investors struggle to accept. Building wealth is often less about doing more, and more about avoiding mistakes. Walter's greatest advantage was not intelligence, timing, or prediction. It was his ability to stay committed when others couldn't. The hardest part of investing is often not choosing what to buy. The hardest part is having the discipline to leave it alone. Time rewards consistency more than excitement. Quiet habits repeated for decades can outperform dramatic decisions made in moments. Walter didn't become wealthy because he found a secret. He became wealthy because he followed simple principles longer than almost anyone else.